Trish, I just want to say thank you for spending a little extra time with me today. For those of you who were with us earlier today, you know that Trish was here joining Fredrickson Learning to present on how we advance learning and performance using AI and data analytics.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Julie. No, I'm super excited. I'm really glad that we're having this conversation.
Cool. I am too. And as you were talking, first of all, just to provide the overview of the landscape of where technology is today, there were a lot of things that jumped to mind for me. So you were talking about a number of technologies that are already here today that you said we're going to start to see in force in 2020 across all facets of our lives. And what started going through my head is, you know, certainly within the field of learning, but in others as well, the technology doesn't always trickle down as fast as we experience it in other aspects of our lives. And so from a readiness perspective, if we as learning leaders want to start figuring out how do we get our orgs on this journey to evolve and start to use data that will help us drive improved performance and start to use AI, how do we get ready for that? And are there critical readiness factors that need to be in place before we can get started?
Yeah, it's a big challenge and common, right, around the world with learning leaders and trying to be able to advance the organization forward and really step up into a partnership, right, and into a leadership position in helping lead the organization into this new arena. So how do we do that? Well, part of it is one of the biggest challenges that we have with people, and we know this from change management and from trying to change any kind of behavior or culture in any kind of context, and that is human beings are really wired for concrete, firm examples, things that we can touch and feel and experience with any of our five senses. We struggle, and we know this from a lot of the psychological and the sociological research, that we really struggle with abstract things that are on these fuzzy time horizons that are, somewhere that seem off in the distance. But the things that are immediate and the things that, again, we can sense and feel and touch and listen to and really have that experience of are more immediate. And so the first thing that we need to do for our organization, for our frontline, for our managers, for our executive team, when it is that we're leading this forward, is to help bring this home, right? Is to provide examples and experiences that helps people connect with what's actually happening and why there's some level of urgency around it. And the best way to do that is to create a condition that allows people to have that kind of experience so that they kind of discover on their own. So the way to facilitate that might be, as an example, for some organizations, it's to take people on a field trip to another organization that's farther ahead, doing something that you have vision for, that you want to help move your organization, your team, leadership in that particular direction. Well, then give them the benefit of an experience of seeing somebody else in the local market or a competitor or somebody in another domain that would be relevant, that would really help them have it in context to actually have the experience and see whatever that is in action. The other one is like, kind of what it is that I was trying to orchestrate in the room today, where we did a lot of examples that really talked about, to your point, our consumer lives, our lives at home, how it is that we're using these new devices like the Ring security device or the Nest thermostat. And then I was talking about how when we travel now, like oftentimes, I think most likely when we go into airports and we see the happy or not buttons now, especially around the washrooms and those types of things. So how do we take something that's abstract, that doesn't feel like it's immediately on fire like every other priority in our work lives is, and how do we help bring it home to people that this is happening and needs attention? We can only do that by providing the experience to them. And we can do that by making it real. And those are a couple of the different ways that we can go ahead and facilitate that. I mean, what do you...
Yeah, so what I'm thinking is, in order to make it real and to also make it something that people care about, it's got to be something that they're trying to solve, that the organization is trying to solve, either the methods that they're using aren't working, or they're not happening fast enough,
Right.
which I think you could say probably about just about anything
Right.
these days. It's not getting the results fast enough. And to make it concrete, something that is really present and tangible for them.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And another vehicle for it is story. So to
Yeah.
your point, how do we get people to connect in a meaningful way? So first we have to have the vision for it. Like we have to have an understanding, what's the direction that we're trying to get people to go, and why do we think that that's really important? And if just telling somebody, what the vision is and why that's important, we have to do that, but it's not enough to compel people. Otherwise, there's all sorts of different human behaviors that we would do just based on information. So how do we have that vision and set that direction, and then how do we help people connect with it? So it's orchestrating the experiences, and then it's also sharing stories. And the stories are things that we can gather from internal to our organization, things that have happened that now make this an imperative, right? Or now illustrate whatever it is that you want people to connect with about being able to move in that particular direction. So briefly, a story that I was actually speaking with a couple of folks with on break earlier today was about, I've actually been consulting with one of the largest food manufacturing companies in the world. And they're at a point of bringing data analytics into their warehouses and their manufacturing process, and being able to use data-informed decisions on all levels of the organization, and especially throughout their entire supply chain. So what does that mean? Well, that means that there's now a big global initiative in being able to standardize on technology systems and being able to standardize on global process. And of course, that can be challenging when your business units and your geographic locations, your offices and your facilities are not used to working together in that kind of a cadence. And in this case, you're taking something, in this case, an organization that's been around for decades, and people, in some cases, their families have worked for this organization for generations. So you have a lot of entrenched, right? There's a lot of entrenched systems and knowledge, and this is the way that we do things, and this is who I am, and this is my identity. We talked a lot today about becoming, right? Helping people become. And ourselves included. So in that context, how do we help people understand, in like a supply chain, in a manufacturing environment, as one example, that the information that they're handling is just as important and needs to be handled with the same care as we do the physical goods that are going through the supply chain. And the way that we found to really do that was to take stories that we had gathered from internal to the organization by actually going to the Gemba, meaning to go out to go where the work is, to go where the work is happening, and talk to people and say, well, why does this matter? Do you have a story of when it's gone right? Do you have a story of when it's gone wrong? And then being able to use those stories to illustrate. And in this case, we were working on track and trace, we were working on traceability and being able to trace back after there'd been a problem with a food, there'd been a consumer notification. And so one of the stories that we found that was really very impactful was about a time when it went really wrong. And if the organization had the information that is so critical to be able to trace back what was driving the root cause of a particular problem. Somebody had something that was not supposed to be in their food that was in their food. If the organization had the appropriate systems and information at the time and the data and analytics to get that kind of insight, they would have been able to have made a difference to the consumer faster.
Yeah.
And so then and people at this organization would cringe when we talk about this story, and we weren't there to shame anybody. That was not the intention, but the emotional encoding and the emotional impact is critical because, to your point, you need people to connect in a meaningful way. This is why it's important. And when they feel that emotion, in this case, I care about my job and I care about what I do. I don't want that to happen again. And now if you're telling me that this training that I'm going through, the support that you're providing me, these resources that the organization has invested in to help me now be more attentive to the information flows and the data flows, that's going to help people really be compelled and connect to what it is that you need them to do next.
Yeah, I like that story because it makes it really tangible.
Yeah.
What the impact is.
Yeah.
And so, as you've been talking throughout the day, an example from my learning organization came to mind. So let me try this on and see if this fits what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
One of the challenges that my business had brought to me, and so my learning team manages learning for call centers,
Yeah.
was you got to cut down the training time. It's too long.
Right.
And I think anybody who does training for a call center has probably heard this. It's too long. It's not that hard. You just got to get them out there. Why can't you be faster? And, a big part of what we knew from talking to our new hires was a significant factor in whether they were going to be successful was their confidence.
Yeah.
And their ability to do the job.
Yeah.
Are they going to know what to say on the phone? Are they going to know what the answer is or where to find the answer? And everybody knows what it's like to not have confidence. It's not a good feeling to have that anxiety that you're not going to get it right.
Especially new on the job.
Oh yeah, totally, where everything is new. And so, just the subjective, let me convince you why I think this is true, wasn't really working. And so what we did was we built dashboards that would give us data about how they were performing during their training and their on-the-job training period. And we showed, it's like you can say people perform differently and they learn at different rates, but to be able to show it,
Right.
and to be able to say based on real-time data inputs
Objective.
that we're getting,
Yep.
objective data, we can give very personalized coaching where it's needed.
Yep.
And we can also, if somebody's mastered it and they're ready to go, let them go.
Right.
Get them on the job
Right.
and get them performing. But there's value in keeping the people in training who need more help.
Yes.
So that we can get them to the same level of readiness, and you're going to ultimately get more value out of it that way.
Right.
So that's the way that we approached using data in a real-time way.
Yeah.
And to be able to say, no, this is why the duration needs to be what it is.
Right. And Julie, you're bringing up a number of really excellent points. And so one of the things is we're used to traditional training, measurement, and evaluation, which is a summative evaluation process, right? We get to the end of something, and then we measure backwards, right? And we go, okay, well, what's the impact study? Did we hit the bell or not? But we're not trying to fix it anymore because it's reactive. It's retrospective. It's looking backwards. We've gotten the outcome, and we either achieve success or not. And so one of the first things that people connect with when we start talking about collecting data in the dashboards in the way that you're talking about is we can actually use data and analytics now in order to inform the solutions, right? The solution design. So these are the interventions that we're going to do. How do we know that these are potentially the best solutions out of all the things that we could do? Here are the things that we think are going to work for our people in this situation right now based on data, right? It's based on we've been able to do these analyses. And then now the third thing is now we can also use the data analytics to then optimize and pinpoint targeted interventions. So these folks here would benefit from additional help and from additional coaching. These other folks, they're already rocking it. We can let them go because there's nothing more frustrating than everybody just sort of getting the same treatment when, one size does not fit all. But now you're able to target your interventions and conserve your resources, right? So now the people who need it the most get what it is that they need, and the people who just need to get on with it get to just get and go. Right? And you're eliminating that kind of frustration. So, and I think now the solution that you did there for your organization, was that kind of homegrown? Like, how did you build that system and start collecting?
Do it's a good question because it is homegrown. And when I started leading the team, we had kind of the traditional measurement and evaluation folks. And they did all the traditional level 1, level 2, maybe kind of sort of dabble in a level 3, not so much. And the level 1s and 2s were on steroids. They were just insanely, complex. And but we still didn't know, are people able to apply it on the job within the real world? It was sort of like, from the ivory tower, we're in a college classroom telling you how to design these
And this
things,
is an interesting study.
Which isn't real world. And I was like, look, we talked about leading indicators earlier today. For me,
Right.
a level 1 and a level 2, they're just leading indicators. They're not all of the leading indicators, but they give you some sense of, is this going well? Is the probability of success higher or lower? If somebody on their level 2 exam, hits the benchmark, that's good. That means they were able to retain what you taught them. Can they apply it?
Right.
Who knows?
Right, exactly.
I have no idea.
Right.
Can
Right.
they apply it within the day-to-day emotional roller coasters that happen in a call center,
priorities
and everything's
yeah.
coming at you at once? We don't know that yet.
Right.
So it's a good data point
Right.
that gives us some sense of where it's going, but we can't judge everything on that alone.
Right.
So what we said was, don't create our own data.
Right.
We don't need to go create our own data sets. And in fact, our business is going to respond more if we take their data.
Yes.
And by the way, that already exists.
Yes.
We just have to get access to
Yes.
it. And we have to make sure we know how to manipulate the data within the system, but it's not crazy complicated. It's Tableau, and it's
Yes.
systems that we have skill sets for.
Right.
And so that's what we took in.
Yep.
And we used very similar, we measured them on the same measures that they would be measured on the job. Instead of trying to sell them on new measurements,
Right.
let's relate it to the measurements that are already important to them.
Yes.
And so on the survey, I said 1 to 2 years. We're probably about 2 years in on this.
Yeah.
We established our proficiency measure, which didn't exist. And now it's being applied across our global network of call centers.
That's amazing.
And now we have kind of these checkpoints, right?
Right.
Like, where should people be?
Right.
And when do you keep people back?
Right.
Because they just need a little more, and we've seen those success stories.
Right.
The first times it was sort of like, oh man, I don't know. Let's coach them more and let's keep them longer, but I'm kind of nervous. They actually performed beautifully.
Yeah.
And so it proved the case. So I think that's an example of the kind of, the look back, would you say, but also using real-time data.
Yeah. Well, both have their merits for sure. And something else that we talked about today, which, and I'm glad you're bringing this up as well, is we don't have to jettison all of the stuff that got us here.
No.
So sometimes people go, well, the Kirkpatrick model, and that's dated, and da-da-da-da-da, and, we look at other measurement and evaluation and traditional and stuff like that. But the fact of the matter is, those things can still serve us today.
Yeah.
We don't have to get rid of them just because they've, been around for some period of time. We can
Right.
still leverage them. But to your point, they have to be positioned in the appropriate way. And so the things, in order to do transformation of ourselves, we can still take the things that still serve us with us and the things that no longer do. And this is an opportunity for us to review what's working for us and what's not, and let go of the things that are not working, but then take those things that are still working, especially when they're familiar and we have some comfort in them, and take them forward. That also means that we do have to do some of the new stuff, and we do have to get outside of the ivory tower that we often call L&D. We are not divorced from the organization. We are not divorced from the operational data.
Right.
We are not divorced from our workforce, and we shouldn't act like it. And so this isn't about L&D hoarding a bunch of data that we generated or that we've got trapped in our own technology systems. This is about coming up with good business questions, in this case in the call center, who needs help?
Yeah.
Right? And then being able to leverage whatever data exists from whatever data source in whatever domain in order to help us answer that question in a meaningful way using data science and decision science in a way that can help us then tailor the interventions and target the right segment of the audiences in order to be able to help them be better at what it is that they're trying to do.
Yeah, so I love that you said that, because one of the things that I really preach to my learning organization is be a business leader first.
Yes.
With a specialty in L&D.
Yes.
Yes. And you have to fully immerse yourself in the business.
Yes.
How they measure their success,
Yes.
what they need to achieve, how they look at both quality and how they look at efficiency.
Yeah.
Because that's where then you bring your L&D expertise to help solve those problems.
Yes.
And you're never solving them by yourself.
No.
There's always other
No.
pieces of the equation that you have to bring into it. And so if you can show up and intelligently contribute to the business discussion at hand,
Right.
there's going to be more appetite for people to listen to the solution that you want to bring to the table. And so that leads me to another question I had from earlier this morning. You talked about, you asked us actually, how much of this whole data science thing, this AI data analytics thing, is math and analytics.
Yeah.
And so the right answer is about 20%. And to your point, you don't have to have those skills yourself. You don't even necessarily have to have them on your team.
Right.
You have to have access to them.
Right.
Most businesses today do have access to those types of resources. But the other 80% is stuff that is already, stuff that we do every day.
In our wheelhouse. Yeah.
In our wheelhouse, and it starts with knowing what questions to ask.
Right.
And identifying what actually needs to be solved.
Right.
We know a lot of times that, people try and throw training as the solution to everything, and we've learned and we know, but it maybe isn't always training. Maybe
Right.
it's something else that is not working well in the environment. But so that brings me back to the questions. So if we're just starting to dabble with this notion of using data, using analytics, how do we know if the business question is well suited to bringing data to the conversation?
Yeah, so really, really excellent point. So there's a few things there to kind of unpack. And the first thing is, exactly, so analytics as a discipline is the same regardless of domain. There's nothing special about analytics applied to workplace learning. I'm sorry to tell everybody, but there's no, other than the types of questions that we're trying to answer, right? And so the types of questions that we're trying to answer from the frame of the learning and performance function would be, or talent development would be along the lines of business questions that are usually performance-based, right? We're trying to figure out something that's having to do with the performance of people. And so we want to look for questions in the performance environment that matter to somebody who's going to make the investment and the commitment to take action. Because this is not an academic exercise. We're not going through an analytical process and analyzing, collecting, and normalizing, and then analyzing the data just to, create a cool algorithm that we can all stand back and be like, ooh, look, cool algorithm, and look, analytical output, this is nifty. We need somebody to actually take that and actually carry that forward. So it starts with that. What's a question that has to do with something that has meaning and matters to the business, that there's going to be somebody who has specific responsibilities around taking that forward. And that's probably somebody in the business, because we in learning often influence but don't have the authority for some of the actions that need to happen in order to really help move things forward. So those are some of the criteria around a good question. And then we have to have really good skills in being able to facilitate a conversation with the business, right? And, so whether that's leadership or that's frontline managers or that's that's frontline staff or whomever it is, could be suppliers, could be customers, we have to be able to facilitate a conversation with them in a way where we're getting their insights out, because part of the question process is forming a hypothesis. Okay, well, here's our question. Which we want to know as a question, going back to sort of your example with the call center at your organization, we want to know who's struggling so that we can identify and help, right? So we're not using it to be punitive, we're using it to be diagnostic so that we can actually provide some support, targeted effort, personalized effort to, down to the individual. So how do we identify them would be a really good question. Okay, well, then you have a hypothesis. You have thoughts.
Yes.
You've been working with this population.
Yes.
You work with other people that have been working with this population. What do you think are the factors that are involved that would be good indicators on alerting you to who's struggling and who's acing it, right? What are the factors that would matter? And one of my favorite tools for that that we perhaps don't often use in L&D is a cause and effect diagram or a fishbone diagram, right?
Yeah,
So
those
how
are
do
great.
we, because then the head of the fish, so if we think of
Yes.
like fish bones,
Yes.
deboning a fish,
Yeah.
the head of the fish is going to be whatever question or problem we're trying to solve, which again in our case is usually a performance problem. And then each major part of the rib, right, coming off the line of the fish is going to be a different area. So what are factors that affect the people? What are factors that affect the policy? What are factors that affect maybe well-being and health? Maybe
Right.
there's a stress issue that's
Right.
happening, right?
Right.
What are factors that are, affecting the managers or whatever, but
Yeah.
we've got kind of the main bones, and then we think about, well, what are the little bones that come off of each one of those different areas? And the object of the game isn't to create a beautiful fishbone diagram. The object of the game is to craft the good question, that we now have a hypothesis. We think these factors matter. We think some of these factors matter more than others. And now we can work with the data scientists to help us understand what data would need to be collected in order to test those hypotheses.
Or do we already have the
And,
data?
and we most likely we already have the data.
Yeah.
We're awash in the data, but this now takes us out of a couple of other things. Number one, we're not just staring at data, and I think it was Mark Twain had the great quote about you can take data and torture it enough to give it any
That's true.
to have it come out with any result or any kind of message that you want to. Of course, I'm paraphrasing. But it's also, we can look at the data that we have and we can stare at it long enough and see all sorts of different patterns, but it has no context, there's no meaning to that. It's just, like we can go swim around in the ocean and look at stuff, but we don't even know what we're looking at because we don't have any context. And instead, before we even try and dive into the treasure trove of data that we are just surrounded with, how do we have the good question, the hypotheses, and then now go looking for the data that we need? And in that case now, that takes us off the hook on having to fix the world's problems, which are data quality and our technology systems, before we can start doing something meaningful in the analytics domain. We don't have to fix all the underlying technology architecture. We don't have to clean up all of our data in order to get started. We just have to have access to the technologies that are going to give us the data that we need in order to answer this question and frame this hypothesis, fuel this hypothesis. And we only need to have the data clean enough to be viable to be used in this particular situation. Now that's true starting out. So if somebody's watching this and they just want to get started, then we can do that as something that we can do now, because it really narrows the scope and really gets that narrow focus. And now we need to manipulate this rather than feeling like we got a clean house and a full housekeeping before we get everything started. That being said, ultimately, we need a more mature workbench as time goes on, because it's not cost effective for us to do just kind of those spot checks.
Yeah.
We need better tools and technology to be able to clean up that data. We need to continue to work on getting better at the data that we're producing, the data that we're collecting, and have data quality management in place, and so on and so forth over time. We don't have to do it right now at this particular second. But that 20% of the data science and the math and the statistics and those analytical models that are based on algorithms that we can work with data scientists to help us craft, that's that middle bit that happens there. And yeah, that's only about 20% of a project. We now have analytical output that comes from that, right? It goes, okay, well, we process the data. We've tested your hypotheses. Here are the results of that test. And there are going to be some things that we're going to discover. We're going to find out in our hypothesis that we worked with others on, hey, we were on point for some of this, and other stuff is going to be like, oh, wow, the data tells us that this factor actually matters more than this one.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But now this is where I call it the bookend. So we did the good question and the hypothesis. We had all that math stuff that happened in the middle, and now we've got the output and we need to do something with it. Those are the bookends. And that now comes back to us to say, okay, well, here are the insights. Somebody needs that insight in order to make a decision or decisions that materially matter to the business. How do we then compel that action? And if we did that due diligence up front, and started with questions that somebody is in charge of taking action on with the insights from the data, we now have sort of a ready-made change champion, because we're changing behavior that's going to happen, because you're not done with an analytics project until somebody has taken meaningful action based on this whole process that you've gone through in order to generate those insights. We're not done, and it's not just about moving data to insights, it's about moving insights to action.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, that's true. One of the things that's going through my head when you talked about, the process of starting with the fishbone, I think that's really smart, and that's probably a good starting place. So let me just share an example of something that we did in my team where we didn't do that. Not to say that we didn't have a lot of conversation about what we were trying to solve, but I think we could have made it easier for ourselves. So what we wanted to do was reduce attrition with our call centers. And we wanted to predict who was going to leave and identify what factors were most predictive so we could get in front of it and stop them before they happened. And
or let them go.
Or let them go.
Or let them go.
Or let them go. It's a really good point. If somebody's not a good fit for the role, for the company, for what have you, for a number of different reasons, it may be that you don't want to try and retain them. But what we did was we actually, and there's a lot of data. And so I think the team looked at 100 different variables, right? They were like, literally, we have like 99 variables that we are looking at to see, is it location, is it tenure, is it team leader, is it rating, is it promotion, is it, all of these things. And all of a sudden they had a list of, 99, 100 of them. Most of them didn't matter at all.
No.
Right?
No.
And so then you get down to this handful.
Yes.
And some of them are surprising and some of them are no does. But what I'm reflecting on is, could that fishbone exercise have helped us skinny down
to start with?
Do you go after 100 or do you say, let's go after the 25 we think are the most compelling?
Right.
But we don't know what we don't know. So is that the place where you ideally have a data scientist to consult with?
Yeah, I think, well, oftentimes, I'm making a generalization. I'm going to make a general statement, and I mean no disrespect to data scientists out there, but data scientists are trained to create algorithms. They're trained to identify factors. So sometimes data scientists fall into that same loophole. Let's go find all the cool factors that might be out there and gather all the data that we might use to create a pretty cool algorithm.
Yeah.
And we're not trying to create a cool algorithm, we're trying to get a business result.
Yeah.
So sometimes that relationship needs to be mediated. So that's where we can, as a learning leader, working with our teams, help get our teams focused on, we're not trying to do an academic exercise. No one is going for a PhD with this in this context. We're getting to a business result at the lowest cost.
Yeah.
Right? So what's good enough, progress over perfection, that's going to help us get there. And because it's not a scavenger hunt to go find all the possible factors that are out there and then whittle it down. It's to find enough that we think is reasonable to work with a data scientist to create the algorithm, to test the hypothesis, and then figure out from that collection which are the ones that matter. And especially when we're just trying to get started. So oftentimes in new analytics projects, when we're just trying to get this done, we want to do something that's way less than 90 days. If you're looking at, we're going to, we've identified 99 different variables, and now we're going to have to go get the data for that, which means that we're going to have to get past the gatekeepers that have access to the data, and we're going to have to get the data and then clean that data up. That's probably going to exceed 90 days. So if you're just getting started with this, so how do we put in like guardrails, right? How do we kind of say, okay, well, here's how we're going to kind of get this started, and we can moderate, we can adjust, but just to give us our own indicators to go, okay, well, here are the boundaries that we want to go ahead and set. So then that can really help, and that's always going to happen. Even if you look at, like, if you had researched another organization that was similar to yours and discovered what factors they had in their flight risk, algorithm, and given everybody flight scores, one of the kind of famous case studies now is HP doing that, figuring out and then assigning each employee a flight risk score that their manager knows, and then you get to make a determination on whether or not you're interested in trying to have interventions to, keep that person, to encourage them to stay. You're predicting whether, or if you're, willing to just sort of let things play out and let them go, because those are the good decisions that we're trying to make based on our judgment, based on the analytical output. We want to, we can look at other models that are out there, but what we're going to find is we can use the same factors and gather the same data, but the weightings for us at our organization with our people in this particular population, don't be surprised if that's different.
Yeah.
So, and the last thing, Julie, just while I'm thinking about it, we also often think that it has to be big data. There's nothing wrong with little data. And big data is actually data that's unstructured. When you take a sampling of big data and get it ready to be able to use in an algorithm, it's no longer big data.
Yeah.
You've already fished out of the massive ocean of stuff and have prepared the data in such a way that it's no longer, it came from big data, but it no longer is big data when it is that it's ready for processing, when it's ready for the analyses. So there's nothing wrong with little data. So like going back to what you were talking about with like the Kirkpatrick method, there's nothing wrong with the Kirkpatrick model and some of the data collection instruments that perhaps we've already used in the past, and data that we have amassed that we might now include in a data set depending on what it is that we found in our hypothesis.
Yeah.
And that being said, we can discover the factors based on our own experiences and brainstorming with others that have some experience in whatever problem we're trying to come together on. We can also research what are other factors that other organizations perhaps have used. And then we can also use artificial intelligence sometimes, if we have the right tools, the right AI tools, to actually take a large set of data, big data, a sampling of the big data, and actually it discerns what factors mattered the most. The artificial intelligence looks for the patterns and then kind of works backwards and says, here are the needles in the haystack that actually mattered the most. So those are 3 different ways that we can do it, but we don't have to have the artificial intelligence and we don't have to have the big data to do it. We can use research and we can use expertise and experience to craft those hypotheses and then use an analytics approach in order to test using the data that we have.
Yeah, so I think that's really encouraging.
Yeah.
Because what we saw in the survey earlier today was, I think, roughly 20% of the audience hadn't even started thinking about how they make a foray into data and data analytics, and another 20% were ready to start. So, I think that's pretty common. And so these are really accessible, actionable methods that we can start to apply on top of what we're already doing. And start to move in that direction without feeling like you have to upend everything that you've done and come up with all new methods.
No. And it's if we can think about it from the frame of, you're starting an R&D initiative.
Yeah.
We're doing a research and development within our operational practice. So L&D operations, our operating model looks like this right now. We're going to preserve that because that's also what our stakeholders expect from us right now. And then we can start a kind of an R&D function, and we can experiment, and in that experimentation, we can stay kind of in stealth mode at first, right? We can use operational data, but we can kind of get our feet under us first as a team and as a learning organization, get some ideas, and then go ahead and kind of market test it, right?
Yeah.
Market test it with our audience, with our internal stakeholders or external stakeholders, if you serve the external customer. And then we can take a look and we can mediate and decide when it is that we're ready to go and kind of show off what we've done. But corporate training comes out of academia, and academia in the Western world has historically celebrated the right solution the first time out, right? So going through an academic process like earning a PhD, you go through and go through and go through iterations that you don't publish until you've gotten it perfect, right? And it's already, and here we're kind of flipping the entire apple cart. Because our ADDIE model in instructional design was also kind of about perfection. We started with getting the requirements up front, and then we kind of made sure that we had those nailed, and we didn't create or develop the assets until we felt comfortable. Like, that's what waterfall methodology is all about. You don't start the next phase in the process until you've closed this one out exhaustively. And that worked for a time when we were building things to last. Now, instead, we need small experiments fast, things that we can do and be nimble and agile, and not just agile, the methodology, but agile, like to be agile, to be nimble, to move with speed. And we have to learn, like engineers, to get good at failing. We're going to expect that the experiment is going to fail. We're going to learn from that, and then we're going to have an opportunity in order to make it better.
So I love that you said that, because the example that I shared with trying to get a predictive model for attrition came as part of a much larger initiative around employee engagement, retention, making the company be a great place that people wanted to work. And, we did fail a lot. And for my team, first of all, they're not used to failure.
No.
They're used to, you get everything to perfection. They're not used to exploring different ways of doing things. And I found that a big part of my job was I had to show them, no, actually there's tremendous value in failure. Look at everything we know now that we didn't know before. Now the scope of our problem just got smaller. Because we can check these things off the list. We know what doesn't work. That's just as valuable as knowing what does work. So don't view that as, oh my God, we failed. You're chipping away at it. Some of these problems are big and they're going to take time, and you should expect that you will fail along the way. And that's good. That's good.
That's progress.
And it's progress, and I think this is the perfect place to segue into thinking about the skills and capabilities we need with our learning professionals and even with ourselves. I love the idea of, going into, kind of silent mode, or you're sleuthing
stealth
mode off on the side. So how do you know who you've got that's equipped for that? Because there'll be a lot of people who hold up their hands to do it, right? And who are just eager and they want to go out there, and maybe that's a big piece of it. But what are some of the core competencies, and how do we think about developing them, helping our staff acquire them? You talked about the citizen data scientist.
From Gartner.
So how do we identify kind of, are there inherent qualities somebody might have? Maybe they're not steeped in a particular methodology or skill set yet, but they've got the capacity for it.
Sure. So we can unpack all of that, and I want to actually. So you brought up Gartner Group's idea of this citizen data scientist, and I took my phone out to make sure that we had the official definition of it. So Gartner Group defines a citizen data scientist as a person who creates or generates models that use advanced diagnostic analytics or predictive and prescriptive capabilities, but whose primary job function is outside the field of statistics and analytics, right? So again, people can be the math nerds, but they don't have to be. We can all play in this. And as we talked about earlier today, as you're bringing up, we can all be really good citizen data scientists, right? Because we can come up with good questions and hypotheses, and then help take the analytical output into the organization to get action done. And part of that, just to touch on, is that, and this is actually from the Gartner Group website, Gartner also says, the reason why we can do that and be successful there is because we can outsource or insource to another group within our organization, or outsource to a person or a platform, because there are lots of analytics platforms that are available now and data science platforms that are available now. But Gartner says more than 40% of data science tasks will be automated by next year. by 2020. And so that's going to increase the productivity and broader usage of data and analytics by citizen data scientists, because we're not going to need to have, that we don't have to be as numerate as perhaps we may think. We can leverage these other kind of modalities. And so that being said, how can we take a look at what are the skills or competencies and capabilities? Well, the first thing is what we've been talking about. What are we trying to do? Right? So as learning leaders, there's a difference between building an analytics practice and applying analytics to a project. And we could do both, again, in parallel, but what are we doing? Because then that's going to inform what team members do we need on the team to do either one of those things. And we're probably going to be doing both in parallel. Get started on a project because people need to have that experience, our team included, ourselves included. We need to go through the experience together. So how do we have a project that's small in scope, less than 90 days, something that's got kind of a quick hit? It's meaningful, like there's some impact on the other end. And we can do a quadrant, we can put together a little quadrant that says, okay, where's kind of the low-hanging fruit, right? Where are things that are going to be low cost, not a lot of effort, but have some kind of impact to it. And we can kind of map a couple of those things out, come together as a team and as leadership and say, okay, let's start there. And then meanwhile, take a look at that longer roadmap of 2-year run in building an analytics practice within the organization, within the L&D function. That's a 2-year roadmap. So if you've got mini roadmap, longer roadmap. So mini roadmap, this is going to give you an opportunity now as a leader too to kind of see where people are at. Right? This is you're going to have some idea. There are some tools and certainly some capability frameworks that we can use in order to really assess people's skills in different roles that are necessary on the team. But now you're going to find out who's good at collecting, who's good at identifying the questions, who's good at facilitating the conversation with your stakeholders to draw those questions out, refine them, better articulate them. Who's good at the math? Who's good at the statistics? Who's good at the data science side? Who resonates with that, right? Who's good at building the algorithms? Who's good at doing figuring out what are the different analytical approaches in order to apply in that particular situation? And then who's good at then taking that analytical output and championing that in the organization to help people learn, because this is new for many people throughout the organization, of course us included, how to make better decisions based on data, right? How to help people trust, how to help people be informed, how to help people not be so scared necessarily of this stuff that's being, created oftentimes by the machines, often by AI-driven platforms, but how do we help them socialize and then drive action, right? Because again, we're not done with an analytics project until we've moved data to insights and insights to action. So there's that piece. And then there's also a piece, so I had the privilege of actually working with the Learning and Performance Institute based out of London. There was a global steering committee that we all got together last year. About this time last year was when we started the project, and we all volunteered our time. And we worked with LPI in order to create a new capability map that actually identifies the capability areas for the modern learning department. And analytics is one of the big capability areas. Technology is another big capability area. And I'm really proud that I led both of those working groups.
Cool.
So what I mean by that is we had working groups together, different sectors, different industries represented. As a matter of fact, Brandon Carson, who was the summit speaker last year, was on my technology working group. I asked Brandon to join us because of, of course, his insights and experiences. And so we, not only from our own experiences, but data that we gathered individually for our capability areas and collectively as a steering committee, came together and said, well, here are the capability areas, here's what we should name them, and the capability area in that map, by the way, is not called learning analytics, it's called data analytics.
Really?
And again, very deliberate and intentional in the name to be like, hey guys,
it's the same.
It's the same. We need to have an understanding that it's the same in this, but it's in an application. We have the domain knowledge and the learning science and those pieces that help us use it through this lens, but the methodology is the same. Exactly. And then we defined the capabilities and then the skills and the competency statements that are actually in the map. And the reason why many of us, myself included, volunteered our time to do it is because that assessment is free to everybody around the world. And so if people such as yourself, anybody watching this, want to be able to use a tool to do an assessment or have their team individually go ahead and assess themselves, what will happen is it'll assess them against the capability map. And then the online system, you can just go out to the LPIs. If you just Google LPI Capability Map, and we also had it in the handouts today, you can take the free assessment online and it'll create a personal competency profile report that gives you your baseline, and then also kind of shows you like, okay, well, you're here and here's where else you could go. And then now as a learning leader, you can sit down with your team and say, okay, we're going to work on your independent or individual development plan, and we're going to use this as one input mechanism, right? It's not going to be everything. And then you as a learning leader can also take a look at now across your team, you know, maybe there's 80% of them that need better use of data visualization or storytelling or whatever it is. Now you can make a decision on how to invest in the team that it's going to give you the most bang for your buck in helping the entire team move forward, because it's a common gap in that particular area.
That is excellent. I'm going to for sure go check out that
Cool.
tool.
There's one other thing that I wanted to bring up real quick too, and we had it in the handouts, and I'm sure as part of the video we can I'm happy to make the PDF file of the handouts available. But I also had the privilege of IEEE, the software engineering consortium, actually created a role a couple of years ago called a learning engineer. And they said, okay, well, if we in learning looked at learning through the eyes of an engineer, how would that be different than how we have historically done it? Which I thought was great, because I created the learning systems engineering framework for the same reason. I'm a daughter of an engineer a few years ago, in order to be able to do just that. Because again, engineers look at failure, they look at input, they look at throughput, they look at output. This is the perspective that we in L&D, this is one of the mindsets, one of the new mindsets that we need to adopt. And so IEEE created this learning engineer, and so we just had a conference in Arlington, Virginia, just this past May, for the community to come together for the first time and really start to put some momentum behind what do we want this thing to be? What do we think it needs to be? What is this role? What is this learning engineering practice? How does that fit? And so what we've come to so far, and I think it's a cool little infographic, because there was somebody who sketch noted it, and I gave them credit in the handout. But part of the conversation is now captured in an infographic based on a sketch note that came out directly from that meeting that we had in Arlington, which was the first gathering ever of all of us to have the conversation. And it basically says, well, a learning engineer is somebody who knows the learning side of it, knows the business acumen side of it, and then also knows the engineering side of it, which would be artificial intelligence, data, analytics. So now, where do we wrap our heads around the instructional piece, the learning sciences, the learning theory, the business acumen, and also all of the technology and technical pieces that are coming into play? So we're going to have a different scale. There might be some learning engineers that at least have an appreciation for the analytical algorithms and artificial intelligence. They're aware, but maybe are not get your geek on deep into that particular area. And we've got others on that spectrum who are, but it all becomes part of that tool set. So I really wanted to make sure that we had representation today on some of the latest and greatest research that's global, that's out there, to say, okay, this is how things are kind of shaping up, and who do we need to become?
So that's really interesting. What that makes me think of is something that I often refer to with my team as systems thinking. Right? And what I tell my team very specifically is, don't stay in your lane. Nobody does anything by staying in their lane. You've got to think about your inputs and your outputs, because you don't get to be successful all by yourself. So from a new hire perspective, my input is whoever got hired by the recruiting team, which doesn't report to me. And if they're not hiring the right profile, then I am sub-optimized. I am
Yes.
only going to be able to
Yes.
achieve so much
Yes.
because the raw ingredients,
Is not,
which is people,
right?
they weren't the right ones
Right.
for the role in the company and all of that. And so we have to care about that.
Right.
We have to have a point of view,
Right.
and we have to influence what that profile looks like. But then the output is equally as important. If we go back to time to proficiency, well, I get them X far
Right.
through training, and then that last 10-15% they need to achieve on the job with their team leader. But it's simple stuff like, are they ready for them? Do they have their own desk? Are they being, how much have they met with their team leader and their coach? Are they being engaged within their team? This is simple stuff, but a lot of times it doesn't happen.
Right.
And so even if my input was good and my piece was good, if then my handoff falls flat, the whole thing still fails.
Yeah.
And so I not only have to care about the input in my part, but I also have to care about what I'm handing off to.
Right.
Because I'm still accountable for it.
Yes.
And so that sounds to me like what you're talking about.
Yes. Yes, it's exactly, it's an engineering system, and
Yeah.
then that also gets into what we've been talking about all day, and that is closed feedback loops as well.
Yeah.
Because so systems thinking is the
Yeah.
interconnectedness of
Yeah.
things, right? So the throughput and the output don't
Yeah.
exist independently of the input, right?
Yeah.
It's heavily
Yes.
influenced by that.
Yes.
It's also that system that you just described doesn't exist in a vacuum. It
Right.
doesn't exist in space where the conditions are static and
Right.
don't change. It
Right.
exists within an organization that is changing
All the
all of the
time.
time.
Yeah.
And so that system, that continuum that you've just laid out, Julie, is susceptible to the environmental factors. And as the conditions change, like we were talking about the happy or not buttons in the airport and the
Yes.
airport washrooms, when the
Yes.
conditions of the washroom change, they need to know about it so they can send a crew in order to be
Yeah.
able to service the washrooms. When the conditions in our system change, and that instructional system or learning and performance system change that affects our outputs and our
Yeah.
outcomes,
Yeah.
we need to know so that we can
Yeah.
do something about
And
it.
so this is where I think learning can play a really, really pivotal,
Yeah.
influential role.
Yeah.
Because if you break out of just focusing on your learning
Yeah.
component,
Yep.
and you start talking about those critical components that go all the way through,
Right.
starting with recruiting to what you do, to
Right.
then, when they're in their jobs and the kind of support, whatever roles they are that they're
Right.
getting on the job, if you can find those data elements that are constants
Yes.
throughout it,
Yes.
then everybody knows when the red button gets hit,
Yes.
it's important to all of them.
Yes.
And they understand the impact that it has on all parts of the chain.
Downstream and
Yeah,
upstream.
yeah.
Absolutely. And that's where I think the talent management, the integrated
Yeah,
talent management
yeah.
models can be really
Yeah.
helpful. So of course I have a picture in my head, but it's the
Me too.
bookends.
Yeah.
There's the, to your point, there's the recruitment piece,
Yes.
the talent acquisition piece that's up
Yes.
front. And then there's the talent retention piece
Yes.
that's kind of at the end here. And then there's stuff that happens in the middle.
Yeah.
We like to call that talent development. We also like to call that kind of learning. There's
Yeah.
how do we get them?
Yeah.
How do we keep them? And I'm
Yeah.
like, great. What are we going to do with them while we have them? And what's interesting too, along with that, is not only is that exactly the right frame to go meta, right, to
Yeah.
go outside
Yes.
of ourselves
Yes.
and have that broader perspective,
Right.
and have an understanding of how those upstream influences from recruiting or talent
Yeah.
acquisition play into the talent development, then play into the talent retention,
Yeah.
the bookends. But then also, what that gives us is it gives us the ability to be able to optimize across that entire
does.
stream,
It does.
to be able to understand those milestone events and how those factors are influencing each other. And again, to your point, we may not have control over all
Right.
of that, but we should at least have visibility
Yeah.
into all of that and be doing a readout of all of that. And it positions us as not being in a silo, but being a strategic partner that's playing with the other strategic partners in a meaningful way of contributing to the success of our people and to the success of the organization as well.
We're probably ready to move on to our evening activities, but I just can't thank you enough. This has been just a really stimulating conversation. I know it's definitely got my brain really moving in a bunch of different directions, and I know I'm personally taking away just a ton to go think about and work on. So thank you for your time.
Well, fabulous. Julie, I really appreciate it. And I think, At the end of the day, all we've ever wanted to do is to have impact, is to really help people be successful, and to feel like we're making meaningful, measurable contributions to the
Yeah.
organizations whom we serve. And this is a way of us being able to do that and helping everybody just work better.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.